Welcome everyone. My name is Tanya and I'm from ProNoCoders, and we started making the switch to Dittofi back in January after first learning about it in December of 2022. So in January 2023, we started embracing the platform and really dedicated ourselves as a team at ProNoCoders to learning Dittofi. I think one of the most tricky things coming to Dittofi if you're coming from another platform is you tend to, I mean, these are languages, right? Like ultimately when you're coding, it's a language. Even when you're no coding, it's a language. It's just a language that is facilitated through the platform. So moving to Dittofi as a platform from Bubble, I very much wanted to make the comparison, like what is the correlate of this thing that I'm seeing in Dittofi back to Bubble, or where do I go into Dittofi to get the same functionality or to work in the same way that I would in Bubble. Now, the two don't always correlate because there are things that you can do in Dittofi that you can't do in Bubble, and vice versa. Although there's fewer things that you can't do in Dittofi that you can do in Bubble, but there are a couple things. So let's just get started. This video specifically is going to cover what I call the front end tab here, which is very similar to our design tab in Bubble. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and pull up an instance of Bubble that we can use for comparison purposes. There you go. So these two apps are actually from the same scope. So this is the Who's Who app that we use to teach Bubble in No Code School, and then this is the Who's Who's app that we use to teach Dittofi in our boot camp and eventually also in No Code School for Dittofi this summer. So this video is covering the design tab in Dittofi, or the equivalent, and that would be the design tab here in Bubble. So to do this, I have laid everything out in Workflowy. Those of you who are familiar with my teaching know that I love Workflowy. So first, we're just going to start with the header, actually. So the header in Bubble is here, this line here, and we're going to compare that to this line here in Dittofi. Starting with our build and debug mode. So haven't really worked much with build and debug, but clearly it's the idea is that you're going to be logging errors so that you can see what's going on. So this is not something that we do often, or that I do often in Bubble either. Like when you hover over preview, you can do some things here, doing safe and no community plugins and no community plugins in HTML to kind of get a clearer idea of what you're looking at to help you debug. I don't think these two are correlated strongly, honestly. I think this is much more reflective of Dittofi being closer to the code than Bubble is in terms of our experience. Then we have the build code. Now, build code is something that we don't also have in Bubble. There's no, we don't have to build the code anywhere in Bubble. We just click the preview and it takes us to the page. But we are required to refresh the page, and that's the correlate there, is that having to refresh the page anytime you make a change in Bubble's editor on that preview, you have to refresh the page to get things to load properly. In Dittofi, it's just an extra step here in the builder. We click this button, it builds the code. I'll just show you. You can watch it go across the top, builds the code, and you would do this after you make any changes before you click the preview button in Dittofi. And so that's the difference. We just wait for the code. I have some issues here because I've been making changes to this app, just demonstrating it. And so this tells you, hey, you've got some problems. You should probably regenerate your code. It's not going to let you generate it if it knows that there's a problem with it. This is a little bit different than Bubble, because Bubble will tell you that you have issues, but it'll still let you go and preview whatever's going on. So in Dittofi, we need to actually get the code generated and get the green response, the success response here before previewing. In Bubble, there's like, okay, you have issues, but you can still view whatever's going on. in your app. We'll go ahead and build your code for you in Dittofi terms and let you view where you are with things in your preview. All right, next up in Dittofi, we've the preview button itself is slightly different. So there's when we click the preview button in Bubble, depending on where we are, um, usually if we're in the design tab and we click on a page here and we click preview, it's going to take us to that page. Sometimes we have to be a little clever about it because we have to be logged in as a certain user, or sometimes if a page has a data type associated with it, we actually need to start on the page before we would get to that page in order to send in the data correctly in order to get to what we're looking for in terms of a preview. In Dittofi, it's not quite the same right now. When we preview, it takes us to the home page, no matter where we're previewing from, and then we would have to add our own page path to get to where we want to go. So if I want to go to login, I would need to, that's probably not what it's called. Let's see here, login. I have this dash here. So let's do dash in. There we go. And you can see how fast it is. This is one of the things that we love about Dittofi. Dittofi is a purely one-page app, so switching your screen, it's super, super fast. All right. So when I click preview, I have to add my own page path because it doesn't read which page that I'm currently on from the editor in order to tell where I want to go with my preview. It's just slightly different. You get used to it. Publishing is you can when you're building your code, you're publishing it to your sandbox link here, and then if you want to add a custom domain, you can add it from here. This is slightly different than Bubble. Bubble has you do it from the settings. The closest approximation to settings here in Dittofi is this branch icon down here, which we'll go over a little bit later. So this would be the correlate of the publish button here is coming to where we have development and we can deploy the current version to live. So this brings us to version management. Version management and publishing in Dittofi is actually a separate button. So you click on the name of the app here and you can see the history, and you can also see other versions, and you can create a new version from this click over here, which is slightly different than Bubble. But this user icon here is pretty similar to what we have. We can click our user icon and we can go back to our home page. We can go back to our plugins page. We can look at our templates. We can go to our account or we can log out. In Dittofi, we can manage our Dittofi account, go back to our workspaces or sign out. So pretty similar, not terribly different. So that's it for the header comparison. In Bubble, we've got in our header, we also have the ability to change which page are reusable that we're looking at, or even go into our backend workflows if we have any backend workflows set up and have that enabled in our app. We can also do our search for our elements, which we can't do from the Dittofi header. It's done differently, which we'll show you in another section. You can, when you have an element selected, you have access to the right-click menu here, and you can see the saved status. And you can also see your issues. So in Dittofi, issues are showing up here and here. They kind of give you visual indicators of where you can go. And and these are all on the page, like kept with the elements for this kind of menu here. So when I select an element, I can get to its menu here on the page in Dittofi. Okay, so let's move on. So we'll go ahead and consider the header explored, and we're going to move on into the front end icon or the design tab comparison now. And we'll start with the elements because that's where we start even in Bubble. So we have our elements tree in Bubble, and then followed by our list of all the different elements types that we can drag onto the page or click and then draw onto the page. And that includes our visual elements, containers, input forms, reusable elements, and element templates here. So in Dittofi, they start with these visual elements. That's the first click here when you click on elements and you're in the elements tab of elements. Then you can search for an element here with this handy search tool. And then this is very much like our menu here with the visual elements, the containers, the input forms, and the reusables is in a separate tab in Dittofi. So we've got our layout, basic blocks, typography, media, forms is like our input containers, components are the different pieces that we can use to build our app. We have some native ones here, like our drop downs and our pop-ups are called modals here. So this is the element. So if I'm building a page from scratch using the no-code editor in Dittofi, this is where I would come to draw the elements on my page. Once an element is drawn on the page, I'll show you where we would go to like modify how that looks on the page. Much like in Bubble, there's a separate place that we do that. And then but I think more important to understand is that the way we've been using Dittofi is we haven't been building our pages from scratch in Dittofi. In Bubble, you have to. You can use templates, but they all have to be Bubble elements that are on the page in order to get things to render in Bubble. You can use HTML elements to put things onto the page, but it's really not the same, not quite the same as using, not quite the same. It's not interchangeable. And so what we've been doing, and I'll cover this later, is we've actually been importing our own HTML and CSS into Dittofi and working with CSS frameworks to get the look of our page just right. And then after the elements are on the page, then if we need to change them or modify them per the logic of the app and how the app is going to operate on those elements, then we make those changes using the no-code editor. So this is the element section. One of the sections here that I think is really important to note is this partial here. That's related to these partials over here. This has to do with our reusables. So in the way that Dittofi works with partials or reusables, as we would call them in Bubble, is you don't create them in a separate editor. You can convert an element in Bubble. So if I'm in Bubble and I want to convert something to a reusable, I can right click and I can convert it to a reusable element. In Dittofi, I can come into something and I can create a partial from it here in this menu. And when I do that, it creates it in this partials section here. The nice thing, or I think great thing about working with partials in Dittofi as opposed to reusables in Bubble is that I don't have to go to a separate editor to make changes. So one of the things that I find a little bit annoying working in Bubble is that if I do have a reusable on the page, if I want to edit that reusable, I have to go to a different editor entirely, different section entirely, in order to make changes to that reusable. And I find it very tricky because there's often, or not often, there's always a little bit of a lag moving from a page, right? Just that like little section, that little wait going back and forth, and then even the time that it takes to find the right reusable to move to. I often will find the reusable on the page and then go to edit the element, but then I have to go back to the menu in order to get back to my page. And just going back and forth, and managing that in the tabs is kind of tricky, adds a little bit of time. It's just annoying. In Dittofi, I never have to do that. In Dittofi, I can make a change to a partial. Once something's a partial, I would double click on it in order to make the change. I make the change, it changes it everywhere where that partial exists in the app, and I can just keep it on the same editor, and I love that about Dittofi. Dittofi also has a concept called prefabs. Prefabs is they're created in the same way. So I can click the menu here and I can create a prefab from anything. And then that puts that element, the copy of that element here in this prefab. But it's a static like snapshot of that element that I can then use as a template in other places in my app. And so when I edit a partial in any instance of that partial in Dittofi, it edits every instance of that partial. But if I use a prefab and I edit the prefab, it only changes that instance of the prefab. It doesn't change the instance anywhere else. And then we have custom components, or how you can create your own components to come into the elements menu here. So you can create your own. Let me see if I can move this. Create a new component. You can name it. You can say which category it's going into, which library it's going into, and then you can add your HTML, CSS, and your JavaScript, and add any properties and dependencies that you want. So this is pretty cool. This gives you a direct way to modify your interface for building and working with things in Dittofi. And then the libraries that it's talking about, you can have your libraries listed out here. So you can create a new library and keep certain elements in it, and then share those libraries with other editors in your workspace, which I think is very cool. So that's an example. That's the example of the difference for all of the parts. So not the elements tree, but for all of the rest of what comes under the elements tree in the design tab of Bubble. One last thing I would mention is that I think I said before, it's important to pay attention to the partials here. And the reason is because your partials carry across with you into other apps in your workspace. So it really makes it easier for you to reuse components across the apps in your Dittofi. It's like you're building your own library automatically, which I think is very, very cool. Next up is the Navigator. Navigator is the equivalent of our elements tree in Bubble, which I've been a critic of the elements tree just in general in Bubble for a really long time. I think it's the hierarchy, like going off to the right. Even when I have it expanded, I'm using a plugin to get this effect, or not a plugin, an extension to get this effect. And so you can see the native version of the elements tree is what most people are working with, and the more you get into it, the farther over everything goes, till sometimes you can barely even see anything off here. You just can't even see it anymore. And I think being able to drag this over would be good. Not that Dittofi has that, but I would say this is my number one priority in terms of feature requests for Dittofi, is to improve this version of the elements tree, this Navigator thing. So this is supposed to help us get to our elements really quickly on the page. One of the things that you'll notice is that these are all named the same. And so my first request to Samuel at Dittofi has been, please let us rename these things so that we can tell them apart. And they just need to improve this interface a lot, just generally, because I find it very tricky to use this to navigate, which is, it's called a Navigator. But if you're looking for the equivalent of the elements tree uh, in Dittofi, the Navigator is it, being able to move around and find things. Another thing that I think is really interesting is in Bubbles elements tree. I can hide things off of the page, right? I can click the eye and hide things off the page, but this has no bearing on what happens when I publish, when I preview and the it's refreshed on the other page. So this is not tethered to whether I can actually see it when I preview the page. It's just tethered to whether or not I see it in the editor. That's not true in Dittofi. In Dittofi, when I click on something, if I hide it here and then I build my code and then I preview it, I won't see it on the page, and it actually hides it off of the page entirely. Not entirely thrilled with that particular feature. I find it very confusing coming from Bumble, but perhaps it has some uh, good use cases for it. So this I would say is my number one thing that I would like to change about Dittofi, and James and Samuel are aware that that's my priority. I think being able to find what you need in the elements tree, aka Navigator here, is super important. I also think the one thing that is missing here that I really, really want is the ability to search for an element in this format, being able to search for an element by name, which only makes sense once you can actually rename the elements. That has to come first, and I understand why we don't have that yet. So that's the Navigator or elements tree. Now let's talk about pages, because pages in Dittofi are very, very different than pages in Bubble. I think I mentioned before that Dittofi is a one-page app by default. This means that your whole app is available, and you don't have to reload pages moving from page to page. So in Bubble, when I make a distinction between a page, when I go to load that page, in the future, like when I go from one page to the other, I have to refresh and load the app again, and that's a problem in Bubble because page loads are relatively slow in Bubble. In Dittofi, page loads themselves are super fast, but there's no page refresh that needs to happen when you're moving from page to page to page. Pages in Dittofi are more like folders for the code, just keeping things organized. So Samuel has said that they are working on some like hierarchy of pages so that we can better organize this list. But really, in effect, there's no page change, just like there's like no reusable change in Dittofi. And this is powerful because this leads me to my next point that will come up when we're talking about variables and front-end actions. But before we head there, let's just talk about the home page having some special properties. So we've got page name, description, and slug, and redirect rules, and page variables are all available on all of the pages. But on the home page specifically, we also have SEO settings. I think Samuel and I discussed adding SEO settings to each of these pages so that we can dynamically populate what we want to for SEO settings based on each screen that we're looking at. And then you also have a custom code that you can um, add to your home page, but not your other pages. And you can also import libraries. You can see we've imported the Bootstrap framework, and we have our own custom CSS file here. And this is important because it has a major effect on how your app looks. If I remove this rule and I save it, everything would look different. I don't think I will save it because I want to keep it, but everything would look different if I took my frameworks off of this page. and that's where you can make those kinds of edits, which is going to be really important when we talk about how you can import code into Dittofi to get started with the front end. Then the reason I love the single page app part really comes in with using variables and front end actions. So for variables, we can think of these as our custom states in Bubble. I think that's the closest approximation. So in Bubble, a custom state is only available on the page where it's created. A custom state has to be attached to a particular element, and a lot of times the recommendation in Bubble is that we would attach custom states to the top level element itself. So you could come in here and you could create a custom state. The thing is that custom states are meant for session use only. It's not stored in your database. And because they have to be attached to an element that's on the page, they're only good for that instance of the page. As soon as you refresh the page, they have to be reset. Or if once you once you change pages, they have to be reset. So the refreshing of the page is still true. If I click the refresh button, my variables are going to empty out, and I would need, workflows, or in this case, actions, in order to repopulate them. But this is a much bigger deal in Bubble, because with Bubble, when you're using multiple pages, you are having to load those pages, and so you do have to reset those custom states, and you have to do the work of setting those custom states all across the page. Now we can get around this with plugins using local storage and some things like that, but in Dittofi it's much more native. The variables are not attached to pages. They're not even attached to specific elements. You create the variable, and then you tie the variable to the elements, but it doesn't matter which page it's on. That variable will stick to whatever you've tethered it to, and you can tether it to multiple things. It's just much more flexible that way. The other interesting thing about variables that I really appreciate is that we have different content types available to us in Dittofi that we just don't have in Bubble. So there's not really a correlate. So in Bubble, if I go to create a new custom state, I can set its state, which content type I want that state to be, right? And I have lots of options here, and I can tell it that I want it to be a list. But the problem is that I don't have access to I just have access to the reference to the user if I decided that the state would be a user type. I don't actually have access to making changes. It has to be part of the database for me to start making changes to a list of things that are objects. I think that's the point I'm trying to get, is that we don't really have objects outside of our database in Bubble, but in Dittofi we do. So if I wanted to, say, keep track of a line item and the quantity, but not save it to the database, that's going to be really tricky in Bubble. We actually have to use a plugin to get the information and extract it from a repeating group, that sort of thing, in order to try to manage stuff like that. In Dittofi, we have a concept called custom models. And custom models you can think of as object variables, meaning that it's not stored in the database, but it does have multiple properties, so key value pairs, and you can store a list of custom models in your variables in order to work with them. So let me just show you the kind here, this direct comparison of this menu to this menu. So I can keep a list of certain things, or this is like if I wanted to keep a list of these types of data. Or I can do a collection, which is a list. In this case, a collection is a list of records in the database. Or I can do a collection of what's called a custom model. And the custom model is going to be an object, It's going to have key value pairs like name is text, phone is text, but it's all in one. And it's an object, and I can have a list of those objects in Dittofi. I think this is one of the most powerful concepts coming from Bubble to Dittofi. If you've ever been working in Bubble and you got caught up on that barrier, trying to work with lists of things that aren't in the database, um, this is the answer, or at least one answer that I find really appealing is working with custom models. We're going to go into custom models more in a different video, though. As you can see here, if I look at my different options here, this is just kind of like a list here, but there's some patterns here. We've got object related things like collection, a collection custom model, a custom model itself, and then we have system custom models and a list or a collection of system custom models. I also think of the unique universal ID and the JSON as all being object related. Then we have date related, are the date and date time. So in Bubble, we store dates as timestamps always. In Dittofi, you can store a date and a timestamp separately. You have different data types for that. The file here is related to system custom model and collection system custom model. So files are worked with a little bit differently in Dittofi. Then we have number related. So we've got numbers. This would be integers, and number with decimal would be numbers that are fractions, right? And then model is related to the database, just a language thing. They call it a model in Dittofi. Then we have our text related ones here. So you can see these break down into different categories of things. Very similar to Bubble, but also specifically the custom model things are very different and much more capable than in Bubble. And then we also have, let's move this out of the way, we have page parameters that we can create here as well. So these are, you can create a kind of parameter here and whatever its name and its expression is, so you can work with URL parameters. And all right. So then, so drawing the difference between Bubble and Dittofi, I think I mentioned this before, but just in practice, I think it's important to see. So I am in an input here, and I come into my settings for this input, and you can see that it's not currently bound to a variable. So in Bubble, when I draw an input on the page, Bubble creates a variable or a state for that value for me. It's very automatic, and then that automatically, just by the existence of that element on the page, I have that element's value as an option in all of my dynamic dropdowns. The exception being if that element is within a repeating group, then it's only available within that repeating group. So in Dittofi, it's very different. In Dittofi, I actually take an input here, and I have to specify to which variable I would like to have it bound. So our front end variables here are called global, are what's in the global menu here. And so you can see I have one variable that I've created called a customer front end variable. And if you go into the custom model, you can see it's just a name and a phone number is what I'm keeping here. And so when I go to this input here, now this is an email, would have been better if I had an email one, but if I want to bind this variable, it doesn't currently have any value that I can reference anywhere. If I want to bind it, I can click bind, and I can grab the variable that I want, and I can say, I'm going to bind this input to this variable. So if I make changes to this input, it's going to make changes to this particular variable. And in this case, one aspect of this particular variable. And that's how I would bind this element, this input element, and whatever the user types into it, into a variable that I can then use and modify using my actions. And I can do that, I can use that variable on any of the pages with any of the elements. And that's why I think it's super powerful. The same goes with my front-end actions. Now, I'm not going to go into the front-end actions to really show you like this editor. This will be for a different video. But I do want to discuss a little bit about the differences between Dittofi and Bubble in terms of front-end actions and back-end actions. Just like with the variables, my actions in the front end are not tied to a particular page or even to a particular element. I create my variables and my front end actions separately from all that's happening in my visual editor. And this is powerful because in Bubble, every time I create a new action, it's usually tied to a specific thing on the page, right? So any of my click actions are tied to elements on the page, which means that if I have the same workflow that I need to put on two different things, this button and this button, let's just pretend the header, and in this case right now, the header is not actually in a reusable bubble. So this button and this button, and then the login buttons have the same exact actions. Let's say they were a little complicated. They weren't simply redirect actions. If being redirect actions, we just put two different workflows on the same page for each of these. So 4 workflows in total. But let's say the sign up actually had a bunch of actions. It was a little more complicated. Then it might make sense for me to create a custom event in Bubble and then have each of the buttons call a specific custom event. So we're looking at the custom event as a workflow, and then we're looking at each button having its own workflow, and suddenly having really 2 different actions that we want comes into 6 different workflows in order to represent it, because we would need a custom event for sign up, a custom event for login, and then we would need to call each of those custom events twice, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 custom events equals 6 things. In Dittofi, that's very different because I can create my front-end action. My front-end action is available to any element on any page that can be clicked or operated on in order to trigger a front-end action. And I would only need 2. So we would go from having 6 actions to having 2 actions. And I find that much more elegant because I can take this front-end action that I have here, which is clearly problematic because it doesn't have, it has that. So let's just build our code and see if that takes care of our issues. It might or might not because I have some other stuff going on in this app. Nope, didn't work. But basically, if I come back into here, I can say if I wanted my button here in this login to be the same as my registration. Let's see, login, privacy, reset, sign up. If I wanted to make it the same as this sign up button, I could, because I can come into this button and I can say, hey, I want to put that action on it. So I only have one action called action. Now I've tethered it to this one button here, and I can come back into my login and I can click on this button and I can add the exact same action to it. So 2 instead of 6. So, and instead of, 2 instead of so one action for two different buttons. So one workflow instead of two, right? Saves us time and it's more elegant. All right, and then we'll come back into in another video like all the differences in setting up the front-end actions and how Dittofi does front-end actions and back-end actions differently than Bubble does. So just moving across this line here, right? We've got in here, these are different breakpoints. People who are familiar with Webflow have seen this before. So you can click on one of these and you can build, make sure things look right at that width, that particular width, and it's going to apply those styles essentially, those classes to everything that's at this width and up in this case, or 1280 and up and so forth. It's just from what I understand, a handy way of doing things. I am not a designer, so I don't utilize design thinking as often as my colleagues do. But it is interesting and it is really important to understand how these things are working, so that you can get the desired results in the way that your app is looking. So then moving here, this is one of the most powerful and probably the most powerful thing about Dittofi compared to Bubble is I'm on my front end and I can click this code here and you can see whatever I have clicked in terms of elements, I can see the code directly here. And I can make changes to this code and click update and it will make the change in the canvas for me instantaneously. It's really fast. And while I don't like the navigator here, I do like this separate trail that you get down here, this breadcrumb trail to go back up the chain all the way back to the body. I like this, and I think once we combine it with the names of the containers so that we can rename our containers and our elements to find things, this is going to be super, super powerful. So this is where we come and we actually interact with the code of the page. So we can come into the body and we can paste the code for the page. And assuming that we have our style sheets referenced in the home page, then things will look the way that we want them to look, and we can go and make little tweaks to the design until it's exactly what we're looking for. And this really makes all of the options that are out there in terms of HTML and CSS templates very, very, very accessible and powerful for us, makes it super fast to build exactly the interface that we're looking for. So that's the code part, and there's no correlate in Bubble to really looking at and viewing and interacting with the code at all. So this is really unique to Dittofi in the comparison. We have our undo and our redo buttons. These are very similar to what we have in Bubble. And then this is just showing when your changes are saved. So we've got our undo and redo, very similar, and our saved indication here. And then we move into our properties editor. So a properties editor in Bubble follows our different elements around. So you can watch what I call the dark gray box change as I select different elements on the page. And I can move this around anywhere I want. I cannot resize it. Well, I can resize the height sometimes. Let's see. Sometimes, no. Sometimes you can resize it height wise, but mostly it's just moving things around moving it around. Dittofi, it is docked to the right side of the editor. So when I select an element, I have the options to look at all of its classes here, and I can start fiddling around with the classes. So sometimes we have to click it a second time to get it to show the classes. So that's just a quirk in Dittofi they're working on. So we've got, in this case, I have 5 different classes that are all applied to this element at any given time. And then we've got the um, the way that this works is a little bit well, not a little bit, a lot different. This is much more similar, I guess, much more similar to Webflow than to Bubble. So however many classes that I'm showing right now on this element, when I make changes to the menus down here, it's going to make changes to this entire set of classes. Like it's going to make changes to this class as applied to all of these other classes. And then when I take it off, I can use that as a custom class on my for my elements. So I'm not as articulate about this section because design is really not my strong suit, just generally. I'm much more comfortable in the logic end of apps. I'm much more of a back-end developer that way. But in terms of coming into here, you can see I can set a custom class. I can bind this to a variable using a text, and then I can have the class show based on whatever is dynamically populated into that variable. So working with classes in Dittofi takes some getting used to. It's like one of the biggest, I would say, jumps from Bubble to Dittofi that I've had to make, and it's one of the things that I need to practice a lot more to become more comfortable with it. But essentially, these classes are what we're going to find when we come into the layout here of in our new responsive editor. The layout, like being able to make flex changes to the element, and also your appearance section. So appearance and layout, that's the correlate to this paintbrush icon in the design tab for Dittofi. And then we have the settings here. This is going to have more to do with our conditionals here, like what conditions or what variables are we going to tie to an element, and then based on those variables, we can define our classes in order to define what that's going to look like when that variable is applied or changed. So trying to draw this out in terms of a comparison, when I define a condition in Bubble, I have the when. So when this is true, I want to change something about this particular element. In Dittofi, it's less about the when part is more about changing things using actions. So it's when I'm in here, I'm telling you all of the classes that are going to apply. Then I can take off certain classes and only apply them in certain circumstances. And usually that's with an action. Something happens on the page and I make changes to the custom class in order to make the look or feel of the element change. So it's definitely different than Bubble and a different way of thinking about things than in Bubble, and it can be a little bit frustrating, but we're working on a course or boot camp for design and Dittofi that can help with that. And then one of the interesting things about your div block settings here is we've got our tags for the type of div that it is. This div is a container. And then our repeating with is separate here. So in Bubble, we have the thing called a repeating group. And a repeating group is a container where everything in it is going to repeat for as many things as we put into like the list of things that it's going to be repeating for. And in Dittofi, we make a specific container, we say that it's repeating and we tell it what that list is going to be, and then we can dynamically populate the things inside of it. So it's very similar to repeating groups in Bubble, except that we can do repeating with on individual elements, not just containers, which I think is really interesting. So we're less reliant on the idea of a separate group that's being repeated. We can do it with a button. We can do it with a text element like a heading. In this case, you can say, hey, this is going to repeat with either a variable or a formula, and you can populate things dynamically based on that, which I think is really cool. And then the show, no show, in Bubble, in our layout here, if we're using our um, new responsive editor, we can say, hey, it's not visible on page load, and then we can use the conditions by which to show it or not show it in that case. In Dittofi, it's much more structured. It is when you place a condition, like when you place a variable here and you say, hey, when the name equals like show no show, it's not going to show unless uh, it's it's populated there. So it's much more the way that I do things. I will not show something and then tell it when to show. I've seen a lot of people in Bubble will show it and then tell it when not to show. In Dittofi, it seems you tell it when to show, and yeah, and that's a little slightly different. And then the custom class is more about adding these classes, which classes you want to um, show, and you tether that custom class to a variable, and you make changes to that variable using actions, and that's how you make things work in Dittofi. Still slightly different, maybe a little more complex in Dittofi, but I think the theme here is that we are getting closer and closer to the code with a no-code tool, and that gives us a lot more power and a lot more capability than not having that closeness to the code. So that takes care of our paintbrush and our classes here. We also have custom attributes that we can add. These are like our IDs and things for the code that we have access to here. Um, the tantamount would be here. So ID attributes here. So we have more flexibility in terms of custom attributes in Dittofi. This tab here is the global classes. These are like all of the classes on the front end that you have access to. I don't think the Dittofi ones are specified here. I think these are just the additional ones. And there's nothing you can really do from this view except see them and then remove them if you want to delete them. So this isn't super powerful yet, but I kind of see it as a placeholder for more powerful things to come in Dittofi. And lastly, I already showed you adding the front end action. So if I'm on a particular element, I can add a front end action to it. There are some extra things that we have available to us in Dittofi that they're working on perfecting right now, but are very, very exciting. Such as in Bubble, we do have like on hover and a few things available to us. So if I'm going to in here for the sign up button here, and I want to make a change to it, let's see here. If I want to define a condition, I can say, hey, when this button isn't clickable, I want something to happen to it when it's hovered or isn't hovered, when it's pressed or isn't pressed, when it's visible or isn't visible. This is really the extent of what I have based on the user's interaction with it. And then I have one more, which is when the element is clicked, I can do something. In Dittofi, I have a few more actions or a few more triggers. I have on click. This is by far the most used one, but we also have a mouse over. So this is the hover. or as you're moving the mouse out of it, on mouse down or mouse up, mouse move or mouse leave. So we've got lots of different mouse triggers besides hovering. Then we've got input triggers, so on blur, on change, on focus, on select, submit, reset, key down, key press, on key up. So lots of different triggers for this button, so we can really fine tune when we want the action to run. Then we have the component triggers. So if the component mounted, then we can run. So this would be like um, are very close to our page load, right? So if I go into my body and I don't have the ability to do something on my body, so I'm going to go into a div in my body. So let's just click out here. So I've got my div block, my first div block, and now I can add an action and I can say, hey, when this loads, so I can say, hey, when this component mounts, after it mounts, then I want to run something. These are like my on-page load. And then I've got my drag triggers. So on drag, drag end, enter, exit, leave, start, and on drop. So this is showing us some native drag and drop features that Bubble just doesn't give us natively. We have to use a plugin for that. So. And this really concludes our exploration of, I showed you that you can look at the HTML and CSS in the code section, and you can follow this trail and you can update it from here. And down here, we've got our just these indicators of some issues that we have in our current build that we would need to clean up in order to be able to build our code and preview it. So this is really the introduction to the design tab correlate in Dittofi. And in our next video, I'm going to come back and we're going to take a look at our front end actions and the editor screen for our front end actions. And then we'll move into explaining, this will lead us into the discussion of how we start to make changes to our database, which leads us into the backend actions and custom models. And then eventually we'll get to the differences between web services and the API connector, and also our settings here, which are very powerful in terms of doing some custom things with Dittofi, like our templates and writing our own custom code. So I hope this was helpful. Please give me a shout with any questions, and we'll see you soon.